Welcome to episode 97 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. At this point in our podcast, we've completed our first line-by-line review of the poem, and we've turned to the presentation of Epicurean ethics found in Cicero's own Ends. Today we continue with that material, starting with line 47, and we have Charles back with us for the discussion. Now let's join the panel with Martin reading today's text.
And on the same principles we shall assert that even temperance is not desirable for its own sake, but because it brings quiet to our hearts and soothes them and appeases them by a kind of harmony. Temperance is in truth the virtue which warns us to follow reason in dealing with the objects of desire or repugnance. Nor indeed is it enough to resolve what we are to do or omit, but we should also abide by our resolve. Most men, however, being unable to uphold and maintain a determination they have themselves made, are overmastered and enervated when the image of pleasure is thrust before their eyes, and surrender themselves to be bound by the chain of their lust. Nor do they foresee what the issue will be, and so for the sake of some paltry and needless pleasure, which would be procured by other means if they choose, and with which they might dispense and yet not suffer pain, rush sometimes into grievous diseases, sometimes into ruin, sometimes into disgrace, and often even become subject to the penalties imposed by the statutes and the court. Men, however, whose aim is so to enjoy their pleasures that no pains may ensue in consequence of them, and who retain their own judgment, which prevents them from succumbing to pleasure and doing things which they feel should not be done, these achieve the greatest amount of pleasure by neglecting pleasure. Such men actually often suffer pain, fearing that, if they do not, they may incur greater pain. From these reflections it is easily understood that intemperance on the one hand is not repugnant in and for itself, and on the other that temperance is an object of desire, not because it flees from pleasures, but because it is followed by greater pleasure. The same principles will be found to apply to courage, for neither the performance of work nor the suffering of pain is in itself attractive, nor yet endurance, nor diligence, nor watching, nor much praised industry itself. No, nor courage either, but we devote ourselves to all such things for the purpose of passing our life in freedom from anxiety and alarm, and emancipating both mind and body, so far as we can succeed in doing so, from annoyance. As in truth, on the one hand, the entire stability of a peaceful life is shaken by the fear of death, and it is wretched to succumb to pains and to bear them in abject and feeble spirit, and many have, through such weakness of mind, brought ruin on their parents, many on their friends, and some on their country. So on the other hand, a strong and exalted spirit is free from all solicitude and torment, as it thinks lightly of death, which brings those who are subject to it into the same state they were in before they were born. And such a spirit is so disciplined to encounter pains that it records how the most severe of them are terminated by death, while the slighter grant many seasons of rest, and those which lie between these two classes are under our control, so that if we find them endurable, we may tolerate them. If otherwise, we may with an unruffled mind make our exit from life when we find it disagreeable, as we would from a theatre. These facts enable us to see that cowardice and weakness are not blamed, nor courage and endurance applauded for what they are in themselves, but that the former qualities are spurned because productive of pain, while the latter are sought because productive of pleasure. Justice is left to complete our statement concerning the whole of virtue, but considerations nearly similar may be urged. Just as I have proved wisdom, temperance, and courage to be linked with pleasure, so that they cannot possibly by any means be sundered or severed from it, so we must deem of justice, which not only never injures any person, but on the contrary always produces some benefit, not solely by reason on its own power and constitution, whereby it calms our minds, but also by inspiring hopes that we shall lack none of the objects which nature, when uncorrupted, craves. And as recklessness and caprice and cowardice always torture the mind and always bring unrest and tumult, so if wickedness has established itself in a man's mind, the mere fact of its presence causes tumult. If moreover it has carried out any deed, however secretly it may have acted, yet it will never feel a trust that the action will always remain concealed. In most cases, the acts of wicked men are at first dogged by suspicion, then by talk and rumor, then by the prosecutor, then by the judge. Many have actually informed against themselves, as in your own consulship. But if there are any who seem to themselves to be sufficiently barricaded and fortified against all privity on the part of their fellow men, still they tremble before the privity of the gods, and imagine that the very care by which their minds are devoured, night and day are imposed upon them, with a view to their punishment by the eternal gods. Again, from wicked acts, what new influence can accrue tending to the diminution of annoyances, equal to that which tends to their increase, not only from consciousness of the actions themselves, but also from legal penalty and the hatred of the community. And yet some men exhibit no moderation in money-making, or office, or military command, or wantonness or gluttony, or the remaining passions which are not lessened but rather intensified by the trophies of wickedness, so that such persons seem fit to be repressed rather than to be taught their error. True reason beckons men of properly sound mind to pursue justice, fairness, and honor. Nor are acts of injustice advantageous to a man without eloquence or influence, who cannot easily succeed in what he attempts, nor maintain his success if he wins it. And large resources, either of wealth or of talent, suit better with a generous spirit. For those who exhibit this spirit attract to themselves goodwill and affection, which is very well calculated to ensure a peaceful life. And this is the truer in that men have no reason for sinning. For the passions which proceed from nature are easily satisfied without committing any wrong, while we must not succumb to those which are groundless, since they yearn for nothing worthy of our craving, and more loss is involved in the mere fact of wrongdoing than profit in the results which are produced by the wrongdoing. So one would not be right in describing even justice as a thing to be wished for on its own account, but rather because it brings with it a very large amount of agreeableness. For to be the object of esteem and affection is agreeable just because it renders life safer and more replete with pleasures. Therefore we think that wickedness should be shunned, not alone on account of the disadvantages which fall to the lot of the wicked, but much rather because when it pervades a man's soul, it never permits him to breathe freely or to rest. But if the encomium passed even on the virtues themselves, over which the eloquence of all other philosophers especially runs riot, can find no vent unless it be referred to pleasure. And pleasure is the only thing which invites us to the pursuit of itself, and attracts us by reason of its own nature. Then there can be no doubt that of all things good, it is the supreme and ultimate good, and that a life of happiness means nothing else but a life attended by pleasure.
Martin, thank you for reading that text today. That was relatively long and relatively complicated. And before we jump into it, there's several background comments I'd like to make. First of all, before I even get into that, the very last line you read contains a word that I think many of our listeners are probably not going to be familiar with. Section 54, it reads, but if the encomium passed even on the virtues themselves. The word encomium is, my understanding, largely passed out of modern English usage, but appears to mean accolades or praise. So the sentence would really mean, but if the praise or accolades passed even on the virtues themselves, over which the eloquence of all of the philosophers runs riot, can find no vent unless it be referred to pleasure. And then the sentence goes on there. But I just wanted to call attention to people who might have gotten tripped up when they heard the word encomium, that it means really nothing more than praise or accolades. And that in itself leads me to a general comment that this section is so packed with tremendously important information that it takes anyone many readings and much listening to get to all of the details that are contained within it. And there's no way in a single podcast that we can do justice to all of the deep material that's in here. We're going to do the best we can to at least point out the major issues. But I just want everybody to understand that there's so much detail here that we can't possibly pass on all of it. And then for that reason, because there's so much in the Torquatus material, one of our podcasters here, Joshua, has consented to produce for us a single reading of the entire material. And we will have that posted as a special section, which we'll post links to where people can find it and listen to the entire selection in one piece. This is really some of the best material on ethics anywhere in the Epicurean text. And I understand the full-length reading takes approximately an hour, so we won't try to have a session where we listen to the whole thing and comment on it. But we really appreciate that Joshua has produced that, and we will have it posted very soon. It's already been produced, but just needs a little more editing before we put it out there for the world to hear. But we really appreciate you doing that. And there's actually one other piece of housekeeping, and that is that today we have back with us one of our podcasters from the past, Charles, who is rejoining us today as we have Dawn going on sabbatical. So with all of that background, here we are. Martin, Charles, Joshua, and I will attempt to at least hit some high points on this section of what we've read today. And where we were, if we go back to line 47, where Martin started reading today, we finished last week with the introduction of the concept that all of virtue is useful in Epicurean terms only for its productiveness or its instrumentality in producing pleasure. And last week, the topic of wisdom was introduced as the first example of even wisdom itself is valued for its usefulness in producing pleasure, just like the art of navigation is valued by a sailor for its usefulness in steering ships. Everything has its purpose. And what Epicurus is pointing to is that the purpose of all virtue is a life of pleasure. So in this section 47 that Martin has started reading for us today, we've turned our attention to temperance as another example of the principle that we're discussing. So now that I've bored everybody with the lengthy introduction, we'll turn to the panel itself. Who would like to start commenting on temperance?
It's worth noting that in here, temperance itself is just another virtue.
Yes, he's going to go through a list of several virtues, which it's my understanding there's sort of a classical list that most of these philosophers would generally turn to, with wisdom being one and temperance being also one.
I think that was actually a pretty big source of contention.
Was whether there's a list and how to rank them? Is that what you mean, or what?
Yeah. What is virtue?
Right. There's also that. I know when Thomas Jefferson wrote his letter in which he talked about Epicurean philosophy and he listed the virtues, I think I've read he followed the list of virtues that are included by Cicero here in this text. Joshua?
That's interesting. I did not know that. That's good to know.
One of the commentators I read said that. But yes, of course, at the very end of his letter to William Short, he said he appended an outline of Epicurean philosophy that he produced, he said, years ago when he was writing his letter. And he actually outlined the list and contrasted them with their corresponding vices.
Right. So we're starting with temperance, which presents an interesting problem, doesn't it? Because when you've gone and made pleasure the goal of life, the immediate problem that you invite is sort of what you might call the Cyrenaic problem, the problem of the heedless pursuit of pleasure. And so the question is, if you're going to pursue pleasure as the goal of life, and you're also trying to avoid pain and trouble and anxiety and annoyance, how do you navigate these waters, right? How do you steer a path between, all sensual pleasure all the time, but also avoiding pain and anxiety? And temperance would seem at first to be a great answer to that problem, isn't it? Because temperance is a virtue in which you keep your heedless pursuit of pleasure down to a minimum so that you can depending on your philosophical orientation, you can pursue what the actual goal in life is. But for the Epicurean, the goal in life is pleasure unmixed with pain. But what he says here, of course, is what he's more or less been saying all along, which is that temperance, just like the actions of illustrious men, just like everything else we're talking about, temperance is not something that you pursue for its own sake. You pursue it because, as you mentioned a little bit ago, Cassius, it's instrumental in the life of pleasure that the Epicurean is trying to organize for himself or herself.
Right. To drop back for just a second, carrying further what you're saying, I looked up the Jefferson list, and to put it in context, Jefferson's list of virtues was number 1, prudence. Now, is that the same as wisdom? Jefferson's list of 4 was prudence, temperance, fortitude or courage, and justice. And then he said, to which are opposed folly, desire, fear, and deceit. Are there 4 principal virtues? Or I was thinking there might be 5. Is wisdom and prudence the same thing, or are they separate?
Like I said, there's some overlap between them. I mean, it's kind of like, foresight and being careful.
Yeah, because wise is something what not everybody can achieve, no? But everybody can be prudent.
That's a good point that Martin makes, because this is something that comes up again and again in Epicurean philosophy. When you read Diogenes Laertius and that biography of Epicurus that he gives, I think in book 10, one of the things he does is he goes into this list of what the wise man will do and won't do, and it's never clearly articulated. I think he uses the word sage in some translation. It's never clearly articulated how attainable the state of being a sage is, or a wise man is for the average person. I certainly wouldn't call myself a sage, and I probably think there's no point in my life when I'm ever going to call myself a sage, right? So it does invite a difficult question of how do you apply what Epicurus is advising to yourself when you do not consider yourself to be wise and or a sage.
Are those two separate things? There's even a comic book out there, or a book called Epicurus the Sage.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a status of being a sage that is different from simply being a wise man, or are all wise men considered to be sages? Or does a sage mean a teacher or some particularly wise man? Because wisdom is one of these superlative virtues that if you're wise, there's no degrees of wisdom, supposedly.
Well, what he calls it here is wisdom and unwisdom.
Yeah. Listen, I just did a quick Google, and there's all sorts of references to this. One page I'm reading says, in books 2 and 4 of Plato's Republic, Socrates introduces and describes the 4 chief virtues needed for justice to thrive in a polis. He presents them as courage, moderation, justice, and wisdom. So it sounds like that there are 4 cardinal virtues, and that although there's different words that can be used with each one, there's 4 of them, and prudence, justice, courage or fortitude, and temperance. So temperance is different than, I would think that temperance could be consumed into prudence, but they're apparently different for some reason.
Oh, I would put temperance under moderation myself.
Okay, I think moderation and temperance is 2 words for the same thing. But wouldn't you put temperance and moderation under wisdom or prudence?
I don't know, Cassius. Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. This is an arbitrary category of virtues. It really has no meaning.
I think you're right about the arbitrariness, yeah.
It would be imprudent to not moderate.
Yes. Yeah. Martin, this is also, I think the Catholics are big into this, and for some reason I think you have more knowledge of Catholicism than I do. Is there something that stands out about how to divide these up 4 ways?
No, I don't recall this from Catholic religious education. They are much more concerned with sins rather than virtues.
The 4 points of the cross or something.
Yeah. Well, maybe it does go back all the way to Socrates and Plato then in the Republic, and that's where this list of 4 comes from. So we just have to deal with it, I guess.
Martin actually made an excellent point there that sin is the primary concern of the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
Reading here, it says, after Pope Gregory I released his list of 7 deadly or capital sins in AD 590, then at that point a list of 7 capital virtues was identified. But you identified the sin first, and then the virtues are sort of the mirror of the sins, aren't they? Chastity, temperance, charity, diligence, patience, kindness, and humility.
Since you have the list pulled up, what was vainglory changed to?
Vainglory is pride. Pride's always in most lists of sins somewhere, it seems like. But I guess what we have here is that Epicurus was working in his time period with what Plato and Socrates had come up with as 4. And so where we are in the picture probably then is that last week he introduced wisdom or prudence, I guess. And now we're on temperance or moderation. And then he'll turn to courage and justice before it's over. But right now, to start with, which is a long way of trying to wind our way around to what we're focused on, we're probably on the issue of moderation, temperance. And Joshua introduced the issue that the purpose of moderation is to produce pleasure.
I think where moderation comes in the Epicurean life is you are the master builder, right, of your own happiness. Epicurus is the master builder of human happiness, but you're the architect of your own life, and you have to take responsibility for it in some way. So moderation is another tool in the toolkit that you can use. You're not required to use it. There's no law that says you have to use it, but it's another tool in the toolkit that can help you in your calculus of choice and avoidance. It can help you lay the foundation for a maximization of pleasure over a whole human life, as opposed to just heedlessly pursuing pleasure in the here and now.
I can tell that we're not going to get far in the text that Martin has read today, because I want to stay with this one for a while, because what you've just reminded me of, Joshua, I really have a problem with moderation and temperance in the first place. I mean, the others make sense to me. Everybody's familiar with justice, courage, and wisdom. That makes sense. But I've always had a particular issue with identifying just to be moderate, to be in the middle. Moderation for the sake of moderation. That sounds like Barry Goldwater there. And I'm not trying to stray into politics, but this is just well known. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. And supposedly something like that's actually traceable back to Cicero. I know I've read that, but to repeat it again, the phrase was moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. So let's stick with that as a way to discuss this. That's the sense in which moderation, I think, is questionable. To me, courage, wisdom, and justice all ring true as superlative. You don't want to be anything other than have as much courage as you possibly can and as much justice and as much wisdom. But why would anybody ever aim for moderation as a goal unless
they're scared?
It's not moderation in total, but it's because moderation may require discipline. For example, in the past, it was very hard for me to be moderate in eating very delicious food. So I would overeat some kind of food, and only when I got older, I managed to gain this ability to be moderate in my food intake.
So, okay, that's the sense in which I think it's clear what we're talking about. The ability to control yourself and look to the big picture and realize what you're about to do is going to cause harm. That's a self-discipline concept to me. That's not being moderate, it's disciplining yourself. Josh?
I was looking up a citation. A little bit ago, I said, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. Immanuel Kant said that. The problem, though, is if you were to ask Plato, I think he would say something like the opposite of that. He would say that if a person were to study a pure system like geometry, they could emerge with an understanding of there's 4 virtues that derive from this mathematical fact, and there's a golden mean that you can study by looking at this, and that you can arrive at something sort of abstract, but also totally true in all places and all times. So moderation, when I think of the golden mean, I do think this is sort of central to a type of Greek culture, isn't it?
It's Aristotelian, yes. And I think I'm firmly against this idea of a golden mean. And I think that I consider golden mean to be almost trademark Aristotelian and not something that exists within Epicurus. I may be wrong about what I just said, but let's talk about that. What is the golden mean to you, Joshua?
The golden mean, to me, of course, I haven't looked at anything about this in a long time, but it's the idea that there's some optimal point that's not necessarily at the center between two proposals, but there's an optimal point at which utility, aesthetics, beauty, at which all these things converge, and that if you were to try to apply that to your life, that's the kind of life you should live. You should live a life centered on the golden mean. Does that make any sense?
I think it makes more sense than most expressions of it that I've heard. But I think in common discussion, it becomes like being in the middle for the sake of being in the middle. It's like that there's always something, there's too much of it, there's always too little, and where you always want to be is right in the middle, is the way I think a lot of people would interpret it colloquially. And I just don't know that makes any sense in Epicurean philosophy, that there is a middle ground. I can see Plato and the Stoics and everybody else kind of in the same position. If you think virtue is the goal of life, then you go after virtue with every bit of energy that you have. You don't go after virtue moderately.
Yeah.
You go after it with every bit of energy that you have. And I think from an Epicurean perspective, pleasure as the goal, you go after pleasure with every bit of energy that you have. And you would never describe that as moderation in the pursuit of pleasure. To me, that's a major disharmonious way of looking at it.
Say you had two choices that resulted in different amounts of pleasure, each with no pain behind them to follow. One was moderate. The other one was much more pleasant, for lack of a better word. Why settle for less?
Yeah, why settle for less than the best? To me, that underlies almost all these philosophers. You should start out by defining what you think the best is, and then you go after the best with every bit of vigor that you have.
Because if pleasure is the good in life, and if it is the goal, then
you want the purest pleasure that you can get.
yes,
You want the most pleasure and the least pain. And yes, what Joshua said a minute ago, you're going to end up making all sorts of decisions to avoid certain pleasures and engage in certain pains because of the final result you're looking at. But I don't consider that to be, you're not trying to be moderate. You're trying to be wise. You're trying to be prudent. You're trying to use self-discipline to navigate to the ultimate goal, which is the most pleasure.
And it's not specifically the amount of pleasure that's the deciding factor. It's the pain afterwards.
It's the full picture. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But you don't pursue the full picture with less than every ounce of energy that you have. So I think there's an issue of definitions that, like there usually is in what the word is we're talking about. Because the word moderate is a word that in my mind, that's like lukewarm in the New Testament, where, what is it, Jesus spit out the lukewarm or something like that. If moderation means lukewarmness, then I would say nobody should have anything to do with it. But it doesn't.
The other problem here, though, which I kind of think we're skirting around a little bit, is that the golden middle or moderation, whatever you want to call it, it's a moving target, isn't it? It's you define your position based on how the people on the extremes are defining their position, right? So let's say you're living at a point in time in which Jonathan Swift has just published his modest proposal, in which he says got too many kids living in poor conditions and working in coal mines and stuff. So in order to ameliorate that problem, and then also the problem we're having with maybe food supply issues, why don't we just eat the children? Doesn't that make sense? And so if somebody puts forward that idea and you're a moderate, you're in the middle, you've just swung far to one side, because he's staked out, obviously this is satire, but he's staked out a position that is so extreme that your current position has not even accounted for it. So now you've got to account for it and then move on the basis of that. Yeah. So you're defining where you are totally by where other people are, rather than by some other standard.
I can't even hear you say that, Joshua, without just, again, sounding like the New Testament. I want to spew that out of my mouth. That is repugnant to define where you are based on where other people are. You define where you are based on where you think you ought to be. And maybe where other people are is a factor that you consider because it gives you information about where you ought to be. But it's by no means the only factor or the main factor, I would think. That's the herd. That's going along with the crowd. That's letting the crowd define your goal and your action, which I think Epicurus is very clear in saying that you don't go along with the crowd.
I don't think Joshua means it like this way. It's more like than just what label you attach to it. So what you do is your choice, but what label you give it on the scale on moderation, that depends on what extremes are then proposed possibly by others.
Or what extremes you think are possible to you, maybe. I mean, just because you may be surrounded by a group of people, Martin, I would think, who are just absolutely stupid from your point of view. And if you just look at the varieties of choices that this stupid group of people gives you, you're not going to want to choose among any of them.
No. This is not, these outside things will not really affect my choice. It would just be, how do I communicate my choice? What label do I give in a way that it can be communicated?
Yeah.
A bit further down, he seems to suggest here that, what does he say? Most men, however, being unable to uphold and maintain a determination they have themselves made, are overmastered and enervated when the image of pleasure is thrust before their eyes. So it was like Martin was saying quite a bit earlier when he was talking about discipline. Temperance seems to be the key to establishing discipline. Why isn't this a virtue then? I don't know.
Well, Joshua, I was going to call your name anyway, because just like you did a couple of episodes ago, to me it helps if I will sometimes just slow down and maybe read exactly what the sentences say, because I see this second sentence in our line 47 actually defines what he means with temperance, where he says, quote, "Temperance is in truth the virtue which warns us to follow reason in dealing with the objects of desire." Okay, so what is it? It's a faculty that warns us to follow reason. Okay, well, reason is, I would have thought reason was within the wisdom or prudence virtue. So what is temperance then? Is it some kind of a warning device within us? Maybe it's just some kind of caution, some kind of feeling of caution. For some reason, that reminds me of some discussions a year or more ago when Martin and Elaine were talking about a feeling of being right about something. It's almost like he's saying that temperance is a feeling. The word warn there jumps out at me as being somehow significant, because if temperance is nothing more than using common sense in the way you pursue things, I just don't see a difference between that and wisdom.
Could be something more innate, like your gut.
A gut feeling, of holding back before you commit all your resources in a particular direction before you're really sure that you wish to. But it's got to do with resolve and discipline and being able to look at an attractive hazard and standing back from it because you realize that for some reason that it is a danger. What happened here today with our time devoted to this subject is that I've always had a real problem with looking at the idea that being in the middle is a desirable place to be. I think it's more the idea that being prudent and being cautious and being wise is something good, but I don't want to be in the middle when I can see a better place than the middle.
But I want to have the ability to be in the middle if I want to. No?
Right, to be in the middle or anywhere else that you identify as the right place to be.
Yeah, but from the examples he gives, it seems to be sometimes to be the most difficult to be in the middle.
What I read in those examples, Martin, is just the difficulty in overcoming the lure of pleasure. I mean, obviously pleasure is desirable and attractive, and you feel attracted to it. But sometimes you have to resist that feeling of attraction because you know that something bad's going to happen to you if you give into it. I like your previous discussion about discipline. I'm seeing it as sort of the ability to discipline yourself, to tell yourself not to follow the pleasure of the moment when you see that a bigger pain lies behind it. What were you going to say, Joshua?
Oh, just something I keep in mind. Anytime I hear this discussion about virtue, this has part to do with my kind of similar to Martin, my Catholic upbringing and Catholic education. It always seems like when you start listing virtues, I don't know how to put this. It's like everyone should idealize this virtue. But when, if patience is a virtue or silence is a virtue or chastity is a virtue, there's always a very clear chasm, I would say, in the enforcement of these virtues based on things like gender, for example. So it's, women are always going to bear the brunt of this, in my view, when you start talking about virtues. It's just something to keep in mind. And what it actually reminds me of is there was a book by Boccaccio called De Mulieribus Claris. It's concerning famous women. It's a Renaissance account of the lives of famous women. And one of the women that he's talking about here, sort of the woman that he talks about who catches the worst rap from Boccaccio, is Leontian from the Garden of Epicurus, who wrote a notable tract against Theophrastus, for example, who at that time was the leader, or was being groomed to be the leader of the Aristotelian school. Is that right?
Yes.
And so one of the things, it's been a while since I've read this, and Cicero makes the same point, actually, when he's talking about Epicurus, not in this passage necessarily, but the word I see in translations is license. This was the license that prevailed in the Garden of Epicurus, was that it got so bad that even women thought they could write essays, thought they could challenge philosophers. So this is something I have to keep this in mind when we're talking about virtues, is there's one set of people who write the rules, there's another set of people who are expected to follow them.
Yeah.
At least Cicero admitted her writing was good.
Yeah, he did.
Not Boccaccio.
Well, one thing that comes to mind to say right now is I picked the text that we read today to some extent because I was going as fast as we could because I knew that Don was about to take a sabbatical and I wanted to cover as much as we could while we had Don here. And I think we accomplished that by introducing the overall issue that virtue is instrumental to pleasure. And we did that through last week by talking about wisdom. But now that Don's on sabbatical and we have Charles and we can take things more at length, I don't know that there's any reason for us to force our way through these virtues that fast. It may be that we could just stick with moderation in this first one, this temperance today, and we'll come back to justice next week, and courage even potentially next week, because those are huge topics, especially justice. Courage, I'm not sure it's going to cost us that much time to deal with. Moving on to the next paragraph, I guess 48 is basically a restatement that the value of temperance is in how it allows us to pursue greater pleasure. And so we either continue talking about temperance for a few more minutes and call it a day today, or we take up line 49, which is courage. Should we do 49 or should we talk a little more about moderation and then call it a day?
I have nothing else on the moderation, so I would suggest let's do current, because I don't have the impression there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk just a few minutes today before we close the episode about courage. It's almost like, I think, going through these virtues so closely like this, you keep coming back to the same issue. This whole discussion of virtue is so artificial and so arbitrary, the way you categorize things, because everything seems to me to fall under wisdom, because if you're wise, you're going to be courageous at the same time. It's nothing more than being able to discipline yourself, as we were talking about in moderation, to realize that sometimes you have to go through bad things in order to get greater pleasure or avoid worse pain.
Like going to work later.
But the good thing about this one, though, is that I was noticing this as Martin was reading it. This one's almost a repeat of some of the factors that Torquatus was talking about earlier about imagine the man who's living the best life, because it talks about here that it's wretched to succumb to pains and to bear them with an abject and feeble spirit, and through weakness of mind you bring ruin upon yourself, but that the courageous spirit is going to recall that the most severe pains are terminated by death, and that the slighter pains grant many seasons of rest, and that those between the classes of pains are under our control. Because if we find pain endurable, we can tolerate it. If otherwise, we may with an unruffled mind make our exit from life when we find it disagreeable, as we would from a theater. So this is the source of the quotation about how we can choose to exit the theater when the play ceases to please us, which is not necessarily a call to suicide, but is a reminder that ultimately, if things get so far out of hand, that death is a relief from even the worst of tortures.
You framed this discussion with one of my favorite stories, actually, from ancient Rome. When you're in the Forum in Rome, and you have a tour guide, they'll point out this little, pit in the ground almost, and they'll say that was the well of Curtius or the fountain of Curtius or whatever. And the story that goes along with that is that sometime in the early prehistory of Rome, I shouldn't say prehistory because it's recorded, but in the very early history of Rome, there was a chasm, a huge hole in the ground, an abyss that opened up in the Forum. And it was growing bit by bit every day. And people couldn't figure out what caused it. So they went to the oracles and they went to the augurs. And the response they got was, oh, this was some god who's done this. And in order to close the pit, you have to throw in your greatest treasure. And so the oracles come back with that, and they're like, okay, we got to throw our greatest treasure into the hole, and then it'll close. If we don't, it's going to grow and grow until it swallows the whole city. And so people are bringing their prize, gold and silver and statues and pearls and whatever else, and they're just chucking riches into the pit. But the pit's not getting smaller, it's getting bigger. And finally, a guy named Curtius sees all this going on, and he has an epiphany. He says, I can't remember exactly the words, but it's something like, Romans, you've forgotten the most important thing about the Roman people. Our greatest treasure is not gold and silver. Our greatest treasure is brave men. And so Curtius, astride on his horse and glimmering in armor, plunges into the hole, into the chasm, and the earth closes in around him, and a spring bubbles up on the spot that bears his name.
That's a fascinating story. I'm getting so much into the story, I'm forgetting the moral that you're about to make of what's the
moral of the story.
That had a completely different ending than I pictured.
You pictured a completely different ending?
Oh, yeah.
Well, okay, so I'd say the moral of the story really is, from the point of view of the Romans, it's just that. It's that courage is the principal virtue for a Roman to have. He does say brave men, so we're going back to that point again, but courage in arms, courage in war and conquering other nations, and really to the point where it comes to identify an entire culture. You know, the Roman legions wore red because supposedly red was the color that would conceal blood, right? And so when you picture that, sort of the insurmountable iron movement of the legions just crushing everything in their path, the heart and soul of that is courage. from the Roman point of view. So what the story means to me is that courage to a certain person is something that is worth living for in itself. But of course, what we're reading here at Torquatus, as we've read on every other subject, is that courage is instrumental in the pursuit of pleasure.
That's something that I had not even really considered here. But clearly, for Torquatus and Cicero to be talking about it, the context that you've just been discussing is really important to think about, because they're not just seeing this as an offhand list of nice things to think about. Courage really was something that the people of that period idealized as an end in itself, as something that's really almost magical.
And was worth dying for. That's
was worth dying for.
You mentioned that.
Yes, that's why we're talking about it. We're talking about the suicide angle.
We may, with an unruffled mind, make our exit from life when we find it disagreeable, as we would from a theater. So Curtius in the story is making his exit from life, but he's not doing it for any reason to do with pleasure and pain, or so the story would have you believe. So you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I got off track because you're talking about what I think is called Lacus Curtius. There's a big website out there, Lacus Curtius, that has a lot of Roman material on it. And I went to Wikipedia while you were talking, and I found Lacus Curtius. It says Lacus Curtius was a mysterious pit in the ground at the Roman Forum, exactly what you said. And then it says, you're talking about Livy's mystical origin. And this paragraph quickly says, the most popular story, the one Livy deemed most likely, was a myth glorifying the nation. Rome was endangered when a great chasm opened on the Forum. An oracle told the people that they were to throw into the chasm that which constituted the greatest strength of the Roman people. And if they did, the Roman nation would last forever. After dropping many things into the ravine, a young horseman named Marcus Curtius saved the city by realizing that it was youth that the Romans held most dear. Well, that says youth as opposed to courage. I guess we'll have to figure that out.
Youth could also be like vigor.
Yeah, but at any rate, he jumped in full armor on his horse, whereupon the earth closed over him and Rome was saved. Now, just like Josh was saying, you could easily analogize that to the story that Torquatus has told about his own ancestors, that he sacrificed his son to save his friends and his life and so forth. So Torquatus has already given an example of sacrificing your son for the sake of pleasure in a sense. So you could say the same thing here, is that Marcus Curtius has given his life because it was going to save the city, and it was of greater importance to him, a greater feeling of significance, a greater feeling of pleasure to save the city than anything else. So you could easily in this scenario see that there are times, whether it's suicide or you simply give up your life for the sake of your friend, you're going to do it because you recognize that continuing to live would be worse for you. But I'm glad you brought that story up, because I did not really connect those two things.
Yeah, I don't know how to talk about it any further than sort of what we've been saying the whole time. Courage, it's a virtue like any other virtue, but even in the most extreme case, he's not pursuing courage just for the sake of courage. You mentioned the ancestors and the question that Torquatus repeatedly asks, what did he get out of it? And it's like, well, he's got a name for himself staked for all coming time in the Forum of Rome. That's not nothing, right? He's saved his family and his kin, and he hasn't saved his family so that they can then be courageous and die saving someone else. This is a pyramid scheme of courage, right? There has to be an ultimate final end here, which Torquatus and Epicurus and we think is pleasure, a life of pleasure.
And when you say it like that, when you say a life of pleasure, that brings up that issue again, is what is the time element there? For Marcus Curtius, his life was over when he threw himself into the pit, but it was worth it to him for moments that he continued to exist to realize what he was doing and to compare the pleasure and feeling of satisfaction of what he was doing against what would have happened if he'd remained alive.
Yeah. See, but in the version of the story that I'm familiar with, the pit is growing over time. So he's going to be swallowed eventually, right? I mean,
anyway,
he sticks around long enough, he's going to end up in the hole anyway. So you can end up in the hole as a coward, or you can end up in the hole as a legendary martyr for virtue and courage.
That's a good point. You'd have to know the facts of the case to understand whether he could have run away from it or not, because if it's going to swallow the whole world, The way Livy's expressing it here on this Wikipedia page, it's more limited than that, though. Something about whether it was going to destroy the whole world or was there a reward? Because the way that Wikipedia is reporting it is it says Rome was endangered, but then if they did throw it into the pit, the Roman nation would last forever. So there was a reward in addition to just continued existence. It was maybe forever existence.
He got all the riches at the bottom.
All right, let's talk about wrapping up for today.
I think you're right that justice is going to be I have a lot more to say about justice than I do about any of these other
Justice
issues.
is hugely controversial.
Yeah, it is, but it's also something that just matters to a lot of people. You could get a bunch of people to disagree on temperance and its value or utility, but I think there's very few people who don't have some conception that a sense of justice is necessary. Anyway, I don't want to open that door because we're going to save that for next week.
Right. It's kind of like your Roman example. At least I have this impression that in Rome at that time period, that courage really was something they thought about all the time. And they were military people. And it was something that was always on the tip of their tongue and the front of their minds. And to some extent, maybe justice today has overtaken that as something that we constantly think about, being just. But yes, we'll talk about it next week in much greater detail. So to wrap up this week, Martin, what closing thoughts do you have today?
I have nothing to add.
I'm sorry I've talked so much today to have talked over you so much, so I apologize for monopolizing. Charles, this has been your first day back with us, and we've continued the tradition of talking about closing thoughts before we end a particular episode. Do you have any today?
Not really.
Well, we're happy to have you back. As we're recording this, we're about to go into Thanksgiving week, and that's going to impact on people's schedules. And I understand you may not be back next week, but we look forward to having you back as soon as you can after Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I should be able to make it 2 weeks from now.
Great. Joshua.
Tune in next week, and I'll tell you a story about ancient Rome and the Tarpeian Rock.
The Tarpeian Rock. Great.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well, thanks everybody for your time today, and we'll come back in about a week to continue going through the virtues, and next week we'll analyze justice. So thanks for being here today, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, invite.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.